On an isolated rural property, a sick little girl is pushed into an iron cage housing hungry wolves. Her millionaire father pretends it's an accident, but his eyes reveal sinister satisfaction as he watches the terrified child cower in the corner of the cage. A hungry wolf approaches with glowing yellow eyes and exposed fangs, when suddenly a majestic white horse gallops toward the cage and feels immeasurable urgency at what it's seeing. The animal doesn't know how to get inside the cage, so it decides to do something unimaginable. A quick note before our story begins. If you, like us, are an animal lover, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our thrilling stories. Thank you. Now back to our story. The afternoon sun spilled its golden light over the sprawling country estate, casting long shadows between the iron cages that spread across the grounds like scars on the perfect green lawn. Lily, all of 7 years old, walked slowly, carrying a weight no child her age should bear. Her hesitant steps echoed against the concrete as she clutched the small teddy bear that had been her only constant companion since she'd arrived at the immense cold house. The girl stopped before the wolf enclosure, fascinated by the majestic animals that watched her with curiosity. Her large, dark eyes shone with a mixture of admiration and fear as she studied the wild creatures her father collected like living trophies. One of the wolves approached the bars, sniffing the air in her direction, and Lily flinched back instinctively, but she couldn't tear her gaze from the animal's savage beauty. Across the yard, a magnificent white stallion lifted its head, as if sensing something on the wind. Its ears pricked up alert as it observed the scene unfolding near the cages. There was something about the moment that stirred its most primitive instincts, a tension it couldn't identify but that left it uneasy. Lily coughed lightly, her breath a little shallow from the condition that had shadowed her since birth. She knew she wasn't supposed to be out here alone, but the loneliness of the great house constantly pushed her into these moments of silent exploration. Her medication had been forgotten again that morning, and she felt the familiar tightness in her chest that signaled she would soon need to rest. The sound of heavy footsteps on the flagstone path made her turn quickly. Her father was approaching, his impeccable suit a stark contrast to the rustic setting of the cages. Richard Montgomery carried an aura of power and control that made even the wild animals recoil as he passed. His calculating eyes swept over the grounds before settling on Lily, and a flicker of something dark crossed his features. "What are you doing out here, Lily?" His voice was controlled, but it was laced with a coldness that made the little girl shrink back. "I've told you it's dangerous to be near the cages." "I was just looking, Daddy," Lily whispered, hugging her teddy bear tighter. "They're so beautiful." Richard drew closer, his domineering presence causing the girl to take an involuntary step back. The white stallion across the grounds began to stir, stamping its hooves as if it sensed something terrible was about to happen. "You need to be more careful," Richard said, his hand landing on his daughter's fragile shoulder with a pressure that seemed gentle but carried a threatening weight. "Accidents can happen when we least expect them." Lily looked up at her father with the innocent trust only a child can possess, not grasping the grim meaning behind his words. She didn't see the cold calculation in his eyes, nor did she understand why her very presence seemed to irritate him more with each passing day. The afternoon was fading, painting the sky in orange hues that reflected off the iron bars of the cages. The wolves grew more restless, as if they too could feel the tension building in the air. The white stallion continued to watch, its nostrils flaring as it caught scents that spoke of imminent danger. Richard glanced around, making sure they were alone. His staff had been dismissed early, and his new wife was in the city attending to her social engagements. It was the perfect moment to definitively solve the problem that Lily represented in his perfectly curated life. "Let's get a closer look at the wolves," he suggested, his voice taking on a falsely affectionate tone that made the white stallion nicker nervously in the distance. Lily smiled, trusting, unaware that she was about to discover that not all monsters live in cages. Lily's heart beat faster as she walked beside her father toward the wolf enclosure. There was something different in the air, a tension she couldn't comprehend. But it made her childish instincts scream a silent warning. The teddy bear in her arms seemed to grow heavier with each step, as if it too sensed the approaching danger. Richard watched his daughter with calculating eyes, measuring her every move, every shallow breath she took due to her condition. The illness that had afflicted Lily since birth had become his perfect excuse. A frail child prone to accidents who could easily succumb to any perilous situation without raising suspicion. "Daddy, maybe we should go back," Lily murmured, stopping abruptly as she realized how close they were to the bars. The wolves had gathered, their yellow eyes glowing with an intensity that made her tremble. "I'm feeling a little tired." "Nonsense," Richard replied, his hand firm, on the small of her back, pushing her gently forward. "You need to learn not to be afraid of everything. How will you grow up strong if you always run from a challenge?" Across the grounds, the white stallion had moved closer to the fence, separating its pasture from the main yard. Its flared nostrils picked up the scent of fear wafting from the girl, mixed with something darker and more dangerous coming from the man. The animal began to pace, its hooves striking the earth in a nervous rhythm that echoed across the silent estate. Lily glanced back, searching for any sign that they should stop, but she met only her father's cold smile. It was a smile she had learned to fear, though she didn't know exactly why. It always appeared when he spoke of accidents or when he purposely forgot to give her medicine. "Look how magnificent they are," Richard said, gesturing to the wolves now clustered near the bars. "Natural predators, built for the survival of the fittest. Nature is wise that way. It weeds out the weak." The words carried a double meaning that Lily couldn't fully decipher, but it made her feel smaller, more vulnerable. She hugged the teddy bear tighter, seeking some comfort in the familiar texture of its worn fabric. The largest of the wolves, an imposing grey alpha, drew even closer to the bars, its eyes locked on Lily, with a predatory focus that made the girl take another involuntary step back. The animal sniffed the air, catching the scent of frailty and sickness she carried. "Don't be afraid," Richard whispered, but there was something in his voice that contradicted his words. "They can smell fear. It makes them more interested." The white stallion had begun to canter back and forth in its pasture, clearly agitated. Its low, nervous whinnies broke the late afternoon silence, as if trying to warn someone of the impending danger. But there was no one else around to hear its calls. Lily felt her legs trembling slightly. The lack of medication was starting to affect her breathing, and the stress of the situation only worsened her condition. She needed to sit down, to rest, to go back to the house where she could recover in safety. "Daddy, please," she pleaded, her voice coming out weaker than she intended. "I don't feel well." Richard looked down at his daughter, and for a fleeting moment, something that might have been remorse crossed his eyes. But it was quickly replaced by the cold resolve of a man who had made a terrible decision and was determined to see it through. "How about you get just a little closer?" he suggested, his hand moving to her back in a way that seemed protective, but was in fact positioning her for what was to come. Just to see them better. The wolves sensed the shift in the atmosphere. Their keen instincts picked up the rising tension, the smell of adrenaline mixed with fear. They positioned themselves strategically near the bars, as if they knew something was about to happen. The sun continued its descent, casting longer, darker shadows that seemed to stretch like menacing fingers across the estate. The moment Richard had so carefully planned was at hand, and there was no turning back. Time seemed to slow as Richard placed his hands on Lily's back. The girl was so close to the bars now that she could feel the wolves' hot breath, see every detail of their sharp teeth as they watched her with growing interest. Her heart hammered in her fragile chest, and she clutched the teddy bear as if it were a shield against the danger she couldn't name. "Now you can see how truly magnificent they are," Richard murmured, his voice laced with a falseness that finally set off alarms in Lily's young mind. But it was too late. With a calculated, cruel movement, he shoved his daughter with just enough force to make her lose her balance. Lily screamed, her arms flailing desperately as she stumbled and fell through the opening in the cage he had subtly unlatched moments before. The thud of her small body hitting the concrete floor echoed across the yard like a gunshot. The teddy bear flew from her hands, landing a few feet away, while Lily scrambled into the corner of the cage, her back pressed against the cold bars. Her wide, terrified eyes locked on the wolves, who were now slowly advancing, their predatory instincts triggered by the presence of a wounded, vulnerable prey. "My God, Lily!" Richard cried out, a convincing performance of horror and despair. "How did this happen? You tripped!" His words echoed across the empty estate, creating the narrative he would tell anyone who asked about the tragic accident. Across the grounds, the white stallion had seen everything. Its intelligent eyes had registered the deliberate nature of the shove, the calculated way the man had positioned the girl. A deep, guttural sound tore from its throat. Not a normal whinny, but something more primitive, more furious. Lily tried to get up, but her legs were shaking violently. The fall had gashed her knee, and she could feel something warm trickling down, blood that only further excited the wolves' instincts. The largest of them, the alpha male, approached with measured steps, its head low, focused entirely on the injured prey before it. "Please," Lily whispered, her voice a desperate whimper. "Daddy, help me!" But when she looked to where he stood, she saw only coldness in his eyes. For the first time in her short life, she understood that the monster she feared most was not in the cage with her. Tears began to stream down her face as she pressed herself harder against the bars. The wolf was now just a few feet away, its yellow eyes fixed on her, studying, assessing. Other members of the pack began to move, forming a semicircle around the terrified child. Richard watched the scene with a mixture of morbid fascination and anticipated relief. Finally, the burden that Lily represented would be lifted from his life. His new wife would be pleased, his business would no longer be threatened by the shame of a sickly daughter, and he could move on with his perfect life. But the white stallion had decided it would not be a bystander. With an explosive movement that startled even Richard, the horse cleared the fence of its pasture, displaying an agility and determination that defied its peaceful appearance. Its hooves thundered on the ground with deafening force as it galloped toward the wolf enclosure. The sound of hooves on concrete made the wolves hesitate for a moment, their heads snapping around to identify this new threat. Lily, still huddled in the corner, looked through her tears and saw the majestic figure of the horse approaching like an avenging angel. Richard finally realized his perfect charade was about to be ruined. "No!" he yelled, but his voice was drowned out by the deafening sound of the stallion slamming its hooves against the bars of the cage with a force that made the entire structure shudder. The impact was so violent that some of the iron bars began to bend under the animal's tremendous power. The wolves, startled by the noise and the display of raw power, retreated instinctively to the back of the enclosure, their instincts telling them they were facing something far more dangerous than a helpless girl. The metallic shriek of bars bending under the white stallion's powerful blows echoed across the estate like a war cry. The animal battered the iron structure with a resolve that transcended natural instinct, as if it fully understood the gravity of the situation. Its dark eyes blazed with an almost human intelligence, focused entirely on creating an opening large enough to rescue the child. Lily watched in tear-streaked awe as the horse continued its heroic assault. Each impact made the bars groan and move further, creating cracks in the concrete where they were anchored. The wolves had completely retreated to the far end of the enclosure, cowed by the stallion's display of force and courage. "Stop it!" Richard screamed, running toward the horse with his arms outstretched, trying to scare it away. But the animal whirled on him with a ferocity that made him recoil instantly. The horse's eyes burned with a fury Richard had never seen in any creature, an anger directed specifically at him. The sound of hooves against iron had become a constant, deafening rhythm that resounded through the surrounding hills. It was a sound that carried urgency and desperation, a plea for help that traveled through the silent afternoon like a battle horn. On the neighboring property, Mike Sullivan stopped brushing down one of his horses as he heard the strange noise. His 50 years of experience with animals told him something was terribly wrong. That wasn't the sound of horses playing or exercising. It was the sound of an animal in a desperate fight. "What the hell?" he muttered, dropping the brush and breaking into a run toward the sound. His seasoned caregiver's instincts screamed that an animal was in danger, and he couldn't ignore the call. Meanwhile, at the cage, the horse had managed to bend the bars enough to create a gap. It paused for a moment, its nostrils flared, its breath heaving from the effort, but its eyes remained fixed on Lily. With careful movements, it began to push its head through the opening it had created. "Come here, little one," its gentle eyes seemed to say as it extended its neck toward Lily. The girl, still trembling, began to drag herself slowly toward the horse, keeping as far away as possible from the wolves, who watched nervously from the other side of the enclosure. Richard was in a panic. His perfect plan was unraveling before his eyes. He tried to approach again, but the stallion immediately took a defensive stance, ready to strike at anyone who tried to stop the rescue. The sound of approaching footsteps made Richard turn. Mike Sullivan appeared over the crest of a hill, running toward the yard with a look of alarm and determination. His experienced eyes took in the scene at a glance. A child inside the wolf enclosure, a horse trying to save her, and a man in a suit watching it all with an expression that didn't look like genuine despair. "My God, what happened here?" Mike yelled, sprinting toward the cage. But it was the horse's behavior that struck him most. The animal immediately calmed upon seeing him, as if recognizing an ally, but it maintained its protective stance between the girl and any threat. "It was a terrible accident," Richard said quickly, his voice laced with a rehearsed-sounding anguish. "My daughter, she tripped and fell in. Thank God your horse was here to help." But Mike wasn't buying it. His years of experience had taught him to read situations involving animals, and something was deeply wrong here. The horse wasn't displaying the typical behavior of an animal acting on instinct. There was an intentionality to its actions that suggested it had witnessed something specific. Lily finally reached the gap in the bars. With gentle movements, Mike helped pull her out of the enclosure, his experienced arms handling her as if she were his own. The girl clung to him with desperate strength, her small body shaking with shock and trauma. "It's okay now, little one," Mike murmured, his voice warm and reassuring. "You're safe." But as he held Lily, his eyes carefully observed the horse's behavior. The animal remained agitated, but only when Richard came near. When Mike or Lily were close, it was calm and protective. It was a pattern that someone with his experience could not ignore. Mike held Lily carefully, feeling the girl's small body still trembling against his chest. His experienced eyes quickly scanned her injuries, a scraped knee, a few scratches. On her arms, but nothing that looked life-threatening. What worried him more was the child's extreme pallor and her shallow breathing, signs that pointed to a more serious underlying medical condition. "She needs medical attention," Mike said, looking directly at Richard. "I'm taking her to my wife. Helen's a retired nurse. She can check her over properly." "That won't be necessary," Richard replied quickly, reaching for his daughter. "I can take care of her. I have the best private doctors on call." But Lily clung tighter to Mike's neck, an instinctive gesture that did not go unnoticed by the old horseman. The child clearly didn't want to go back to her father, and Mike had seen enough traumatized animals to recognize the same behavior in a human. The white stallion, Thunder, moved closer, positioning itself strategically between Mike and Richard. Its behavior was deliberate and protective, as if it were guarding both Lily and her new protector. Mike noted how the horse kept its ears pricked and muscles tensed whenever Richard moved, ready to act again if needed. "That's strange," Mike muttered more to himself than anyone else. "I've never seen Thunder act like this before. He's usually so calm." "Thunder?" Lily asked in a small voice, looking at the horse with awe. It was the first word she'd managed to speak since the rescue. "Yes, little one. That's his name," Mike replied gently. "And it seems he's taken a real shine to you." Richard watched the interaction with growing irritation. His carefully controlled expression was beginning to show cracks of impatience. "Really, I need to get my daughter home. She needs her specific medication." "What kind of medication?" Mike asked, his experience with his nurse wife piquing his medical curiosity. "What's her condition?" The question caught Richard off guard. He hesitated for a moment, searching for a convincing answer. "Respiratory issues, chronic, it's very delicate." Mike frowned. If the girl had serious respiratory problems, why was she alone near dangerous animal cages? Why wasn't there constant medical supervision? The pieces didn't add up in the horseman's practical mind. Thunder began to circle the group slowly, always keeping Richard in his line of sight. It was a guarding behavior Mike had only seen when stallions protected their foals from predators. But why did Thunder see Richard as a threat to his own daughter? "Daddy forgot my medicine this morning," Lily whispered against Mike's ear. Her words so quiet only he could hear them, but they were words that made the old man's blood run cold. Mike looked at Richard with a new perspective. A father who forgets vital medication for a sick child. A man who leaves a frail little girl alone near wild animals. And now the extreme reaction of Thunder, an animal that never showed aggression without cause. "You know," Mike said slowly, "I think it's best if I take her to Helen for a look. Just to be sure there's no internal injury. A fall like that can be tricky." "I said that's not necessary." Richard's voice came out harsher this time, revealing an authority he was used to having obeyed. But Mike wasn't one of Richard's employees, and 50 years of caring for animals had taught him to trust his gut. Thunder was trying to tell him something important, and the girl was clearly terrified of her own father. "Helen will just check her over and have her back to you in no time," Mike insisted, adjusting Lily in his arms. "As neighbors, it's our duty to help." Thunder nickered softly, a sound that seemed to be one of approval. The horse moved to stand beside Mike, creating a physical barrier between him and Richard. It was a clear demonstration of allegiance that left the businessman visibly furious. "Very well," Richard said finally, realizing that to resist further would look suspicious. "But I want my daughter back within the hour." As Mike walked away, carrying Lily, with Thunder trotting protectively alongside, he could feel Richard's eyes burning into his back. There was something very wrong with this situation, and he was determined to find out what it was. An innocent child's life might depend on his ability to decipher the signs Thunder was so desperately trying to communicate. The little girl in his arms whispered one more thing. "He doesn't like it when I get sick. And Mike understood that maybe, just maybe, the accident hadn't been an accident at all. Mike and Helen's house was small but welcoming, with colorful flowers in the window boxes and the comforting aroma of homemade bread hanging in the air. Lily nestled into the soft sofa, still clutching the teddy bear Mike had retrieved for her. Thunder remained outside, but positioned strategically where he could watch the house and any suspicious movement. Helen Sullivan emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a floral apron. Her 60 years carried the wisdom of decades spent caring for people, and her warm eyes immediately filled with motherly concern at the sight of the child. "Oh, my dear," Helen murmured, kneeling beside the sofa. "Are you all right? Mike told me about the accident." Lily nodded shyly, but Helen, with her medical training, immediately spotted signs that went far beyond the visible injuries from the fall. The child's extreme pallor, the slight blue tinge to her lips, the shallow breathing, it all pointed to a serious condition that was not being properly managed. "Can I take a look at those scrapes, sweetheart?" Helen asked gently. "I promise. It won't hurt." As she carefully cleaned the wounds, Helen spoke softly to Lily, her questions seemingly casual, but in reality, a careful medical assessment. "How long have you felt this tired, honey?" "Always," Lily replied simply. "Daddy says it's because I'm weak." Helen exchanged a meaningful look with Mike. No child should accept being constantly ill as normal. As she continued her assessment, she noticed other disturbing things. The child was visibly underweight, her skin had an unhealthy tone, and there were signs she wasn't receiving adequate nutrition. "Lily, do you take any medicine to help you feel better?" Helen asked, keeping her tone light. "Sometimes," Lily said hesitantly, "but Daddy forgets a lot. He says medicine is expensive and maybe I don't really need it." Helen's blood ran cold. As a mother and a nurse, she knew no responsible parent forgets vital medication for a sick child, especially not a wealthy man like Richard Montgomery, who clearly had the resources for the best medical care. Mike watched his wife's expression and recognized the signs. Helen was uncovering something that confirmed his own suspicions. "What do you think?" he asked, quietly. "This child is being medically neglected," Helen whispered back, "possibly intentionally. She has all the signs of a congenital heart condition that isn't being properly treated." Lily, oblivious to the adults' whispered conversation, glanced out the window and smiled when she saw Thunder standing like a vigilant sentinel. "He saved me," she said softly. "Daddy said it was an accident, but I think Thunder knew." "Knew what, honey?" Helen asked gently. Lily looked at the two adults with the devastating honesty only a child possesses. "Knew that Daddy didn't want me to get out of the cage." The silence that followed was thick with horror and understanding. Helen took Lily's small hand, her voice trembling slightly as she asked, "Why do you think that, honey?" "Because he gets the same look when I get better after one of my spells. He looks sad that I didn't die." Lily said this with the terrible matter-of-factness of a child who had learned to accept an unacceptable reality. Mike felt rage building in his chest. This innocent girl had been conditioned to believe her own survival was a disappointment to her father. What kind of monster did that to a child? Helen began making discreet notes on a pad of paper, documenting every sign of medical neglect, every troubling statement Lily made. As a nurse, she knew they would need solid evidence if they were going to protect this child. "Lily," Helen said carefully, "can you tell me about any other accidents you've had?" The girl thought for a moment, then began to list a series of incidents that made the two adults' hearts break. Suspicious falls down the stairs, food that made her sick, medicine forgotten during breathing attacks, and always the same explanation from her father about how she was accident-prone. Outside, thunder nickered softly, as if he could feel the emotional turmoil inside the house. The horse had become more than just an animal. He was a silent witness to a systematic cruelty that was now being exposed for the first time. Mike looked out the window and saw a familiar car approaching on the road. Richard Montgomery was coming to collect his daughter, likely hoping the accident had caused more permanent damage. But now they knew the truth, and Mike was determined not to let Lily go back to that house until they could guarantee her safety. "Helen," he said quietly, "I think we need to make a few urgent phone calls." But the firm knock on the door echoed through the house like an ominous bell. Mike and Helen exchanged a tense glance as Lily automatically flinched on the sofa, her small body curling into a defensive posture that was heartbreaking to see. Outside, Thunder began to pace nervously, his hooves stamping the ground in an anxious rhythm. "I've come for my daughter," Richard declared as soon as Mike opened the door. His voice carried the authority of a man used to being obeyed without question, but there was something else in his eyes, an urgency that betrayed his anxiety about what Lily might have revealed in his absence. "She's still recovering from the shock," Mike replied firmly. "Helen is just finishing a medical check." Helen emerged from the living room with a carefully neutral expression, her discreet notes tucked safely in her pocket. "Mr. Montgomery, I need to speak with you about Lily's state of health." Richard stepped into the house with controlled strides, but Mike noticed how Thunder immediately positioned himself closer to the window, keeping a constant vigil. "She's fine," Richard said flatly. "Just a few scrapes from an accidental fall." "Actually," Helen said with the professional authority of decades of medical experience, "Lily is showing signs of a severe congenital heart condition that is not being adequately treated. She requires regular medication and specialized medical follow-up." Richard's face tightened almost imperceptibly. "My daughter receives the best medical care available. Perhaps your knowledge isn't current enough to understand her treatment." It was a calculated insult, meant to disqualify Helen and end the conversation, but the retired nurse was not intimidated. "When was the last time Lily took her heart medication?" "This morning," Richard lied without a second's hesitation. Lily, who had been listening silently from the living room, murmured almost inaudibly, "I haven't had medicine in 3 days." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard immediately realized his lie had been exposed by his own daughter, and his mask of the concerned father began to slip, revealing something much darker underneath. "Lily sometimes gets confused. Because of her condition," he said quickly, trying to regain control. "You can't trust what a sick child says." But Helen had worked with children long enough to recognize honesty when she heard it. "Mr. Montgomery, as a healthcare professional, I have an obligation to report suspected cases of medical neglect." The threat hung in the air like a bomb, about to detonate. Richard understood he was losing control of the narrative he had so carefully constructed. His expression hardened, showing the true man behind the polished facade. "You're meddling in affairs you don't understand," he said, his voice low but filled with menace. "I'm an influential man in this county. You would be wise not to make unnecessary trouble for yourselves." It was then that something unexpected happened. Outside, the sound of an approaching car made Thunder whinny loudly, not in alarm, but almost in relief. Mike looked out the window to see a sleek luxury car pull up and an elegant woman get out, walking with determination toward the house. It was Isabella Montgomery, Richard's new wife, but her expression was not that of a woman coming to collect her stepdaughter. It was the face of someone who had made a difficult decision and was ready to face the consequences. "Richard," she said, entering the house without ceremony. "We need to talk now." Isabella's unexpected arrival completely changed the dynamic. Richard went visibly tense, clearly not expecting his wife at this critical juncture. "Isabella, what are you doing here?" he asked, trying to maintain control, but his voice betrayed his nervousness. "I came to tell the truth," she said simply, looking directly at Mike and Helen. "About what really happened at the cage today, and about all the other accidents Lily has had." Richard's world began to crumble. Around him, his own wife, the woman for whom he had planned to eliminate Lily, was about to destroy everything. Lily, still on the sofa, looked at Isabella with a mixture of surprise and something that might have been hope. Outside, thunder finally settled, as if he knew that help had arrived from a completely unexpected source. The horse had witnessed the crime, but now there was a human witness willing to speak the truth. "Isabella, you don't know what you're saying," Richard stammered, but his voice had lost all its previous authority. "I know exactly what I'm saying," she replied firmly, "and it's time Lily knew that not all the adults in her life are monsters." Isabella Montgomery took a deep breath, her perfectly manicured hands trembling slightly as she prepared to break the silence she had kept for months. She was a woman accustomed to the most refined social circles, where appearances mattered more than truth, but something had shifted in her heart over the past few weeks. "I saw everything from the office window," she began, her voice hesitant. "At first, but gaining strength with every word. I saw Richard deliberately push Lily into the cage. It wasn't an accident." Richard's face went white. "Isabella, you're having a nervous breakdown. This is ridiculous." "No, Richard. What's ridiculous is that I stayed silent for so long," she retorted, turning to Helen and Mike. "You need to know this wasn't the first time." Lily, still huddled on the sofa, stared at Isabella with wide eyes. It was the first time anyone in her family had publicly acknowledged that the accidents were not accidents at all. Helen approached. "Isabella, gently, please tell us what you know. 3 months ago, I saw Richard push Lily down the main staircase. He said she tripped, but I saw his hands on her back." The words poured out like a liberating confession of long-suppressed guilt. "Last week, I found him putting something in her food, something that made her sick for days." Mike felt a surge of rage. "Why didn't you say anything sooner?" Isabella looked down, ashamed. "Because I was just as selfish as he was. When we got married, I made it clear I didn't want a sick child disrupting our social life. I thought if he sent Lily to a boarding school, or if she was just no longer in the picture, our life would be easier." Richard tried to approach his wife, but thunder began to whinny loudly from outside, as if sensing the rising tension. "Isabella, stop this now. You're tearing our family apart." "We are not a family," she said with a firmness that surprised everyone, including herself. "Families protect their most vulnerable. We were trying to get rid of an innocent child." Lily began to cry silently, not from fear, but from something akin to relief. Finally, someone was telling the truth about her life. Helen sat beside her on the sofa, offering the maternal comfort the girl so desperately needed. "Tell us about today," Mike prompted, mentally logging every detail for the authorities. Isabella closed her eyes, as if reliving the scene. "He planned it all carefully. He waited until all the staff had left, made sure I was supposed to be in the city. But I came back early and saw everything from the office. I saw him position Lily near the cage. I saw the exact moment he pushed her." "And what made you change your mind about staying silent?" Helen asked. "The horse," Isabella said simply. "When I saw that animal risk its own life to save Lily, I realized a horse had more humanity than my husband or I did. A creature without words was doing what I should have done months ago. Richard began to pace, his composure finally shattering. Completely. You don't understand. Lily is a burden. She'll never be normal. Her health problems are an embarrassment to our family, a constant drain on our resources. She is a child, Mike said, his voice controlled but firm. A child who deserves love and care, not to be disposed of. My business, my reputation, it's all at risk because of her, Richard continued, as if justifying his actions to himself. Isabella looked at her husband with a mixture of disgust and pity. You're talking about killing a child for reputation and money. Do you hear yourself? Lily, who had been listening to everything with the limited but devastating understanding of a 7-year-old, finally spoke. Daddy, I'm sorry, I'm sick. I tried to be better. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Thunder's hooves on the ground outside. The innocence of Lily's statement exposed the monstrosity of the situation in a way no adult accusation ever could. Helen took Lily's small hand. Honey, there is nothing wrong with you. You are perfect just the way you are. Mike moved to the phone. I'm calling the authorities. This child is not going back to that house. Wait, Isabella said, pulling a small digital recorder from her purse. I recorded our conversation this morning. Richard admits to everything on the audio. Isabella's small recorder lay on the coffee table like a silent bomb, holding evidence that could destroy Richard completely. Mike eyed the device with a mix of relief and apprehension, knowing they finally had irrefutable proof, but also understanding that a man like Richard wouldn't surrender easily. You can't use that, Richard said, his voice now laced with a desperation disguised as authority. It's a recording made without consent. It's inadmissible in court. Actually, Helen countered with professional calm, when it comes to child protection, the rules are different. And considering you've just verbally confessed in our presence to attempting to murder a child, Richard realized he was cornered. His eyes darted around the room, calculating options, searching for an escape. For a moment, Mike feared he might try something desperate. Lily remained on the sofa, watching the adults with the intuitive perception children have when they sense their lives are being decided. She didn't fully grasp the legal implications, but she understood that someone was finally fighting to protect her. Isabella moved toward Lily, and for the first time since she'd married Richard, offered the girl a genuine gesture of affection. Lily, I want you to know I'm so sorry I didn't protect you sooner. It's okay, Lily replied with the immediate forgiveness of a child. Thunder protected me when you couldn't. Outside, as if he knew he was being mentioned, Thunder nickered softly. The horse had positioned himself where he could watch both the house and the road, maintaining his constant vigil. Mike picked up the phone with resolve. I'm calling Child Protective Services and the Sheriff's Department. Wait, Richard said, his voice dropping to a dangerously low tone. You don't understand who you're dealing with. I have influence in this county. I know judges, sheriffs, politicians. I can make your lives very difficult. It was a clear threat, and Mike felt a chill run down his spine. Men like Richard had resources and connections that simple people like them did not. It would be an unequal fight. You're threatening witnesses, Helen observed. That only makes your situation worse. I'm not threatening anyone, Richard shot, back with a cold smirk. I'm just explaining reality. You're a retired horseman and a country nurse. I built an empire. Who do you think people are going to believe? Isabella looked at her husband with growing horror. How did I marry you? How did I not see the monster you truly are? You saw, he said cruelly. You just chose to ignore it, because you liked the lifestyle I provided. The words hit Isabella like a punch to the gut because they carried a painful truth. She had chosen the comfort of wealth over the protection of an innocent child. Mike finished the call to the authorities, but when he hung up, his expression was grim. They're on their way, but they said without physical evidence or multiple witnesses, it'll be tough to prosecute someone so influential. But we have the recording, Helen protested. And I'll deny it's my voice, Richard said with renewed confidence. Modern technology can fake anything. Lily, who had been listening, quietly, suddenly stood up and walked to the window. "Where's Miss Carroll?" she asked. "Who's Carroll?" Mike asked. "My governess. She took care of me before Daddy sent her away last week. She saw a lot of things," Lily said innocently. Richard blanched again. Carol Jennings had been dismissed because she knew too much, but he hadn't factored in the girl mentioning her as a witness. "Carol doesn't know anything," he said quickly. "And even if she did, she signed a non-disclosure agreement." "NDAs don't apply to criminal acts," Helen said firmly, "especially crimes against children." The sound of approaching cars made them all turn to the window. 2 sheriff's cruisers and a car from CPS were coming up the dirt road. Thunder moved back slightly, but held his vigilant post. "Remember," Richard said in a low, threatening voice, "you're starting a war with someone who has far more resources than you. Think about your own lives before you destroy mine." But Mike looked at Lily, who was holding Helen's hand with trust, and knew there was no choice. Some battles had to be fought, regardless of the odds. "Lily," he said gently, "are you ready to tell these people the truth?" The girl nodded. Her courage, small but unshakable. "Thunder taught me that sometimes you have to be brave to protect the ones you love." Outside, the white stallion watched the authorities arrive like a sentinel who finally sees reinforcements arriving for a battle he had started all on his own. The CPS investigator, Dr. Evelyn Reed, entered the Sullivans' home with the professional bearing of someone who had seen too many hard cases. Her experienced eyes immediately settled on Lily, noting the signs Helen had documented: the extreme pallor, the labored breathing, the fresh injuries from the fall. "Hello, Lily," she said in a gentle voice, kneeling to the girl's level. "My name is Evelyn. I hear you've had a very difficult day." Lily nodded shyly, instinctively moving closer to Helen. The presence of uniforms and officials made her nervous, but the Sullivans' proximity gave her courage. Sheriff Brody, a middle-aged man with a skeptical expression, regarded Richard with a mixture of professional deference and personal unease. It was clear he knew the businessman's reputation and influence in the county. "Mr. Montgomery," the sheriff said, "we need to clarify the facts about today's incident." Richard immediately slipped into his public persona, the respected tycoon and worried father. "Of course, Sheriff. It was a terrible accident. My daughter tripped and fell into the wolf enclosure. Thank God the Sullivans' horse was nearby to help." "Actually," Isabella cut in, her voice trembling but resolute, "that's not true." The sheriff turned to her in surprise. "Mrs. Montgomery?" "My husband deliberately pushed Lily into the cage. I saw the whole thing." Isabella handed the recorder to the investigator. "And I have it on tape." Richard's expression didn't change, but Mike noticed his fists clench slightly. "My wife is going through a difficult time. Emotional stress can cause confusion." I'm not confused," Isabella said firmly. "I am finally being honest." Dr. Reed began her careful examination of Lily, asking gentle questions about her well-being, her health, her daily care. Each of the girl's answers painted an increasingly disturbing picture of systematic neglect. "Lily, when was the last time you saw a doctor?" the investigator asked. "I don't remember," Lily answered honestly. "Daddy says doctors are expensive and maybe I don't need to go." The sheriff frowned. Even someone inclined to give Richard the benefit of the doubt couldn't ignore such a clear statement of medical neglect. Helen approached the investigator with her neatly organized notes. "Dr. Reed, I've documented all the signs of medical neglect I observed. Lily presents symptoms of a severe heart condition that is clearly not being treated." "My daughter receives the best medical care available," Richard protested. "I have the top specialists on call." "Then why hasn't she had her medication in 3 days?" Dr. Reed asked, drawing on what she had heard earlier. Richard hesitated for a fraction of a second, just long enough for everyone to notice. "Sometimes the medication schedule is adjusted by her doctors." Mike decided it was time to add more information. "Doctor, Lily mentioned other accidents, falls, food that made her sick, medicine forgotten during her attacks." "These are normal accidents for a sick child," Richard said quickly. "Lily is prone to stumbling because of her condition." But Dr. Reed was starting to see a pattern she knew all too well. "Mr. Montgomery, I'm going to need to see Lily's complete medical records, including all prescriptions and appointments for the last 6 months." It was then that Richard made his first fatal mistake. Some of those records might have been misplaced. You know how private clinics are, not always the best at keeping organized files. The investigator exchanged a meaningful look with the sheriff. Lost medical records were a glaring red flag in child abuse cases. Outside, thunder began to stir again. The horse could feel the tension ratcheting up inside the house, and its instincts told it the danger to Lily had not yet passed. "I'm going to need to take Lily to a hospital for a full medical examination," Dr. Reed declared. "It's standard protocol in cases of suspected neglect." "That's unnecessary," Richard protested, but his voice was losing its authority. "I can arrange an exam with my own doctors." "No, sir. It has to be with independent physicians." The investigator turned to Mike and Helen. "Would you be willing to accompany Lily to the hospital? She seems most comfortable with you." Lily gripped Helen's hand tightly. "Please, don't leave me alone with him." The words came out in a whisper, but everyone heard them. The raw fear in the child's voice was unmistakable and devastating. The sheriff finally seemed to grasp the full gravity of the situation. "Mr. Montgomery, I'm going to need you to come down to the station for a formal statement." "I'm not going anywhere without my lawyer," Richard said, his mask finally beginning to crumble. "That's your right," the sheriff replied, "but this investigation is moving forward." As the authorities organized the next steps, Lily looked out the window at Thunder and whispered, "Thank you for saving me." The horse, as if it had heard her, nickered softly in reply. The county hospital was a modest building, but Dr. Edward Coleman, the pediatric cardiologist, had a reputation that stretched far beyond the small town's borders. His experienced eyes filled with concern the moment Lily entered his office, supported lovingly by Helen. "My God," he murmured after the first few minutes of the exam. "This child is in critical condition. How was this allowed to go on for so long?" Dr. Reed, who was monitoring the exam, documented every medical observation. The results were even worse than Helen had suspected. Lily was suffering from a congenital heart defect that, with proper treatment, would be perfectly manageable, but had been criminally neglected. Without regular medication, she could have gone into cardiac arrest at any time, Dr. Coleman explained, especially under physical or emotional stress, like, say, being pushed into a cage with wolves. Meanwhile, back at the Montgomery estate, a second investigative team had arrived to process the crime scene. Richard watched nervously as they photographed the damaged cage, collected evidence, and interviewed staff. It was then that an unexpected discovery changed everything. One of the investigators located Carol Jennings, the former governess, hiding out at a friend's house in the next town over. The 50-year-old woman was trembling when she finally agreed to speak with the authorities. "I saw it for months," Carol confessed, tears streaming freely down her face. Mr. Montgomery, he hated that little girl, said she was an embarrassment, a burden. I tried to protect her, but he fired me when he realized I knew too much. Carol revealed devastating details. Medication thrown in the trash when Lily wasn't. Looking food deliberately tainted to cause vomiting, falls that were disguised shoves. She had secretly documented some of the incidents, hoping one day she would find the courage to come forward. "Why didn't you report it sooner?" the investigator asked. "He threatened my family," Carol whispered. "He said if I ever spoke a word, he'd make sure my son lost his job and that no one in the county would ever hire me again. I was a coward, and Lily paid the price for it." Back at the hospital, Lily was finally receiving the medical care she had needed for years. Dr. Coleman had immediately started her on a medication protocol that was already improving her breathing and color. "Do you feel better, honey?" Helen asked, holding Lily's small hand. "Much better," Lily replied with a genuine smile Helen had never seen before. "Is this how I'm supposed to feel all the time?" "Yes, sweetheart, this is how every child should feel." Mike arrived at the hospital with news. Carol talked. She has evidence, testimony, even some photos of previous injuries she took in secret. Dr. Reed shook her head with a mixture of sadness and relief. With Carol's testimony, Isabella's recording, the medical evidence, and the horse's behavior as a witness to today's incident, we have a solid case. But the battle was far from over. Richard had hired the best law firm from the state capital, and his political connections were being mobilized. Rumors began to circulate about Isabella's mental instability and the questionable motives of Mike and Helen. "They're going to try to discredit all of us," Mike said with a worried frown. "Let them try," Helen replied with fierce determination. "We have the truth on our side." That night, Lily slept under proper medical care for the first time in years. Mike and Helen took turns keeping watch by her bedside, while outside her window, a familiar figure could be seen. Thunder had followed the ambulance to town, and now stood in the hospital parking lot, refusing to leave. Security guards had tried to shoo him away, but the stallion simply repositioned himself where he could keep an eye on Lily's window. "It's like he knows it's not over yet," Mike observed. Looking out the window, Helen agreed. "He knows Lily isn't completely safe." The next morning, Lily woke up asking for Thunder. When she learned he was waiting outside, her eyes filled with tears of gratitude. "He really does love me," she said in wonder. "Yes, honey," Helen replied. "And so do we, but the legal battle was just beginning." Richard had managed to get a temporary injunction, questioning Isabella's mental competency and claiming Lily was being illegally kept from her father. His lawyers argued the entire situation was a conspiracy to extort money from him. Dr. Reed received the legal notice with concern. They might get a judge to temporarily return Lily to his custody while the case is investigated. Mike's heart sank. "We can't let that happen." "We won't," Helen said, her jaw set. "We'll find a way." Outside, thunder nickered softly, as if sensing a new storm was gathering on the horizon. The courtroom was thick with tension as the judge reviewed the documents for the emergency hearing. Lily, now looking visibly healthier after 3 days of proper medical treatment, sat between Mike and Helen, her small hands clutching theirs like anchors in a storm. Richard had arrived with an impressive team of expensive lawyers, his impeccable appearance a stark contrast to the honest simplicity of the Sullivan family. His calculating eyes swept the room, sizing up his opponents and looking for an advantage. "Your Honor," began Richard's lead counsel, Arthur Vance, We are here today because a child has been illegally separated from her father by well-meaning people who have been misled by misunderstood circumstances. Isabella sat on the opposite side of the room. Her decision to testify against her husband had cost her everything: her home, her social standing, her marriage. But for the first time in months, her eyes showed an inner peace. The lawyer from the Child Advocacy Center, Sarah Jenkins, a young but sharp attorney with experience in child protection cases, stood up. "Your Honor, what we have here is not a misunderstanding, but clear and systematic evidence of attempted murder against a vulnerable child." Judge Marcus Thorne had carefully reviewed all the documents overnight. His 30 years on the bench had taught him to recognize genuine cases of abuse, but he also understood the political pressure a case involving someone as influential as Richard Montgomery could generate. "Mr. Vance, present your evidence," the judge said. Richard's lawyer began his defense by attacking the credibility of the witnesses. Isabella Montgomery is clearly suffering from a nervous breakdown, possibly brought on by psychiatric medication. Her recording was made without knowledge or consent. "And what of Carol Jennings's testimony?" the judge asked. "A disgruntled employee fired for theft, trying to get revenge on her former employer with false accusations," Vance replied without hesitation. Mike felt rage building in his chest. The ease with which Richard twisted the truth was staggering, but it was Lily who surprised everyone. "Can I talk?" she asked, her voice small but clear. The judge looked at the girl with kindness. "Of course, Lily. What would you like to say?" Lily stood, supported by Helen. Her new medication had brought color back to her face and strength to her voice. "Your Honor, my daddy didn't just push me today. He's been pushing me for a long time." "Lily," Vance interrupted, "you're too young to understand the difference between an accident and—" "I know the difference," Lily said, with a certainty that silenced the entire room. "I know the difference between when someone helps me stand up and when someone pushes me, so I fall down." The judge leaned forward. "Go on, Lily." "Thunder saved me because he saw that Daddy didn't want to save me. Animals know when someone is being mean, even when they pretend to be nice." The child's simple words carried a devastating truth that no sophisticated legal argument could refute. Dr. Coleman was called to testify about Lily's medical state. This child was literally dying from medical neglect. Her blood medication levels were at 0, despite her father's claims she was under treatment. "Is it possible she stopped taking the medication on her own?" Vance asked. "A 7-year-old does not hide her own life-saving medication for months on end," the doctor replied dryly. It was then that something extraordinary happened. From outside the courthouse, the sound of hooves on asphalt began to echo. Thunder had followed the car that brought Lily and was now in the courthouse plaza, clearly agitated. "What is that noise?" the judge asked. Mike looked out the window and smiled. "That's Thunder, Your Honor, the horse that saved Lily. He won't leave her side." "This is ridiculous," Vance protested. "We can't base legal decisions on the behavior of an animal." But the judge was intrigued. "Bring the horse closer to the window." When Thunder was led to where Lily could see him, a magical thing happened. The horse calmed instantly, but when Richard approached the window, the animal shied back and began to show signs of distress. "Your Honor," said Sarah Jenkins, "this horse has consistently displayed protective behavior toward Lily and aggression only in the presence of Mr. Montgomery. Animals are impartial judges of character." The final moment came when Isabella was called to the stand. In a firm voice, she not only confirmed her recording, but revealed intimate conversations where Richard had expressed satisfaction over Lily's accidents. "He told me, in his own words," Isabella declared, "that he hoped this time she wouldn't bounce back." The silence in the room was absolute. Richard finally understood that his web of lies had completely unraveled. "He planned to kill my daughter," Isabella whispered, "and I almost let it happen." The judge looked directly at Richard. "Mr. Montgomery, do you have anything to say in your defense?" For the first time, Richard Montgomery was speechless. His mask had fallen away completely, leaving only a man confronted by the monstrosity of his own actions. The silence in the courtroom stretched for long seconds as Richard Montgomery faced the crushing weight of all the evidence against him. His empire of lies had crumbled, and for the first time in his life, he found himself with no resources, no escape. "Mr. Montgomery," the judge repeated with growing authority, "I am waiting for your answer." Richard looked around the room, at Lily, who watched him with a mixture of fear and pity, at Isabella, whose courage had destroyed his plans, at Mike and Helen, who had risked everything to protect a child, and finally, at the irrefutable evidence piled against him. Something broke inside him in that moment. Perhaps it was the sight of Lily, finally healthy and rosy-cheeked, showing him what she could have been if he had chosen to be a real father. Perhaps it was the realization that he had become the very kind of monster he would have despised in others. He began, his voice hoarse and broken. "I did it all." The entire courtroom held its breath. Arthur Vance tried to intervene, but Richard raised a hand to silence him. "I tried to kill my own daughter," he continued, the words torn from his soul, "multiple times. I denied her medication, I caused accidents, and today I tried to feed her to the wolves." Lily began to cry silently, not from fear, but from a profound sadness for a father she had loved unconditionally, even as he tried to destroy her. "Why?" the judge asked, his voice filled with genuine bewilderment. Richard looked at Lily, and for the first time he truly saw her, not as a burden or an embarrassment, but as the innocent child who was born to love him without condition. "Because I was a coward," he admitted. "Too cowardly to accept that my daughter wasn't perfect, too cowardly to face social judgment, too cowardly to be the father she deserved." Isabella covered her face with her hands, finally understanding the full magnitude of what she had nearly allowed to happen. "Richard," she whispered, "how did we get here?" "We got here because we chose our own convenience over a child's life," he answered, with a brutal honesty that stunned everyone. "And I became a murderer." The judge leaned forward. "Mr. Montgomery, do you understand that you are confessing to the attempted murder of a minor?" "I understand," Richard said, looking directly at Lily, "and I understand that my daughter is better off without me." Lily suddenly stood up, her small legs carrying her toward her father. Helen tried to stop her, but the girl gently pulled away. "Daddy," she said, her voice small but clear, "I forgive you." The words struck Richard like a bolt of lightning. The absolute generosity of the child he had tried to destroy was more devastating than any legal punishment could ever be. He sank to his knees before his daughter, tears streaming freely down his face. "Lily, I am so sorry," he sobbed. "You deserved a better father." "I have one now," Lily said, looking at Mike and Helen with love. "And maybe you can learn to be better too." The judge watched the scene, deeply moved. In decades on the bench, he had rarely witnessed such a display of forgiveness and grace. "Given the defendant's full confession," the judge declared, "I hereby grant permanent emergency custody of Lily Montgomery to Mike and Helen Sullivan, who have demonstrated the capacity and genuine love for this child." Applause erupted in the courtroom. Carol wept with relief. Isabella smiled through her tears, and Mike and Helen hugged Lily as if she had always been their own. "As for Mr. Montgomery," the judge continued, "he will be remanded into custody to await trial for attempted murder, child neglect, and systematic abuse." Richard nodded in agreement. "That's fair," he said simply. Later, as Lily was officially placed in the Sullivans' care, she made one last request. "Can I see Thunder?" Outside the courthouse, the white stallion waited patiently. When he saw Lily approaching, healthy and safe, he nickered softly and lowered his head for her to pet him. "Thank you for saving me," she whispered in his ear. "Thank you for teaching me that there are good people in the world." Isabella approached hesitantly. "Lily, I want to ask for your forgiveness too. I failed you." Lily looked at her former stepmother with the surprising wisdom of a child. "You changed your mind at the right time. That's what matters." Isabella nodded through her tears. "I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to make up for my silence." "You can start by helping other kids," Lily suggested, "so they don't need horses to save them." And so, surrounded by her new family and with Thunder by her side, Lily Montgomery Sullivan began a new life, one where she would be loved, protected, and cherished for exactly who she was. 6 months later, the Sullivan farm had transformed into something magical. Where once there was only a modest farmhouse, a home now blossomed, full of laughter, love, and hope. Lily woke every morning to the soft nickers of Thunder, who had officially become her horse and best friend. The golden morning sun streamed through the window of the room Mike and Helen had decorated especially for Lily, with cheerful colors and drawings of horses on the walls. The girl jumped out of bed and ran to the window, smiling as she saw Thunder grazing peacefully in the pasture, his white coat gleaming like silver in the morning light. "Good morning, my hero," she whispered, and the horse lifted its head as if it had heard her, whinnying happily in reply. Helen appeared at the door with a mug of hot chocolate and Lily's morning pills, now administered with love and religious regularity. "How are you feeling today, my dear?" "Strong," Lily answered with a radiant smile. "Very strong." And it was true. Under proper medical care and the unconditional love of her new family, Lily had flourished in an extraordinary way. Her heart condition was completely under control. Her color was rosy and healthy, and her energy seemed boundless. Mike came into the room holding an official-looking letter. "Lily, something important came for you." The girl opened the envelope with curiosity, and her eyes widened with surprise and joy. "It's from Isabella. She opened the sanctuary." Isabella had made good on her promise to atone for her past mistakes. With part of the fortune she received in the divorce, she had created a sanctuary for rescued animals and a support center for abused children. The letter was filled with photos of happy kids playing with therapy animals. "She says she thought of me when she created it," Lily said, beaming with pride, "and she wants me to come visit and meet the other hero horses." The transformation of the old Montgomery estate was also remarkable. The wild animals had been relocated to appropriate sanctuaries, and the space was being converted into an educational center for animal welfare and child abuse prevention. Carol had been hired as the coordinator, finally finding peace by using her experience to protect other children. In the afternoons, Lily would ride Thunder through the green fields, her laughter echoing on the clean air. The horse had become not just her protector, but her teacher of courage and confidence. Together, they explored the world with a freedom she had never known. Mike watched from the porch, his heart overflowing with fatherly love. "She's so happy," he murmured to Helen. "She finally gets to be a kid," Helen replied, wiping away a tear of joy. "She finally gets to dream about the future instead of just surviving the present." That evening, as they ate dinner together in the cozy kitchen, Lily made an announcement that deeply touched her adoptive parents' hearts. "I want to be a veterinarian when I grow up," she declared, "to help animals like Thunder save kids like me." "You can be anything you want to be, sweetheart," Mike said with pride. "But why a vet?" Lily thought for a moment, her expression serious beyond her years. Because animals see the truth when people pretend not to. Thunder taught me that. Courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing the right thing even when you are. Later, Lily was in her room, drawing in her new art pad. The picture showed a small girl riding a white horse, surrounded by other happy animals and children. In the corner of the page, she had written in her careful script, "Real families are made of love, not blood." Helen found the drawing the next day and framed it, placing it on the living room wall as a daily reminder of the miracle that had happened in their lives. Richard, serving his sentence, had found an unexpected purpose in prison. He volunteered in rehabilitation programs and wrote letters to child protection organizations, sharing his story as a cautionary tale for other parents who might be losing their way. In one of his letters to Lily, which Helen would read to her, when they arrived, he wrote, "My dearest daughter, you taught me that forgiveness is the most powerful form of courage. I hope one day to deserve the love you showed me." Lily always asked Helen to write back, "Daddy Richard, I'm learning that everyone deserves a second chance to be better. Keep trying." On a special Sunday, 6 months after the trial, Lily organized a small party in the yard to celebrate her second birthday, the day Thunder saved her and her real life began. Carol came with a homemade cake. Isabella brought new pictures from the sanctuary, and even Dr. Coleman stopped by to see his favorite patient thriving. As the sun set, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Lily sat on the wooden bench. Mike had built just for her to watch Thunder. The horse came close and rested his head gently on her shoulder, a gesture of affection that had become a daily ritual. "You know, Thunder," she said softly, "I used to think I was a broken kid, but now I know I just needed the right people to love me the way I am." Mike and Helen came over, hugging their daughter from both sides. "And we needed you to teach us that a real family is built with love and choice," Helen said. "Every day I thank my lucky stars you stumbled into our lives," Mike added. "Even if it was in the scariest way possible." Lily laughed, that crystal-clear sound of pure joy that had become the soundtrack of her new life. "I didn't stumble," she corrected with a mischievous smile. "Thunder brought me to you on purpose." As the stars began to appear in the night sky, the family gathered around the garden table for another evening of stories, games, and unconditional love. Thunder grazed peacefully nearby, keeping his protective watch that would never end. Lily. Montgomery Sullivan had found her true family, her true home, and her true life, and somewhere in the starry night, other children who needed saving could feel the hope carried on the wind, the promise that there will always be brave souls willing to risk everything to protect the innocent, and that true love will always prevail over the darkness.